Welcome to Beyond the Rings. Grab whatever you're drinking, because tonight we're going back down into Moria, and I promise you, what actually happens down there is so much stranger, so much more theologically loaded than a wizard fighting a fire demon on a bridge. That's the trailer version. That's the 11-year-old in a theater in 2001 version. We're doing the version where you've read the letters, where you've sat with unfinished tales at 2 in the morning, where you know that You Shall Not Pass is doing a lot of narrative heavy lifting for something that is, structurally, an unresolved fragment of the War of the Powers playing out under a mountain 3,000 years after everyone thought that war was over. Let's start where the wound actually opens, because it isn't the Balrog. It's mithril. It's greed, plain and simple. And Tolkien is not subtle about this if you're actually paying attention, instead of just watching Gimli look wistful in a ruined hall. In Appendix A, in the account of Durin's folk, we get that line everyone quotes and nobody sits with. They delve too greedily and too deep. Everyone treats that as a cautionary aside, a little morality tale footnote before the real plot starts. But think about what's actually being described. A people so fixated on a single, irreplaceable substance, a metal literally too precious to remake, too rare to ever recover once spent, that they mine straight through the floor of their own kingdom into whatever was sleeping beneath it. That is not a new story in this legendarium. That is Feanor's oath, wearing a different face. Tolkien tells Milton Waldman flat out, in that long, sprawling 1951 letter, that the corrupting force running underneath almost every tragedy in his world isn't cruelty for its own sake, it's possessiveness, the desire to own a thing so completely that you'll burn everything around it to keep or obtain it. The Silmarils do this to the Noldor. Mithril does this to Durin's line. Different metal, same trap, same architecture of doom. And here's a wrinkle most people skip entirely, because it's buried in a completely different chapter of the Silmarillion. The dwarves aren't even supposed to be here, cosmologically speaking. Go back to Of Orly and Yavanna. The dwarves weren't part of Eru's original vision, the way elves and men were. They were Orly's impatient side project, made in secret, ahead of schedule, and only permitted to live because Eru, catching him in the act, chose mercy over erasure and folded them into the plan retroactively. That origin matters here. Durin's folk are structurally adopted children of the story, granted existence through an act of grace rather than original design. And what do they do with that grace, generations later, sitting on top of the richest mithril seam in Middle-earth? They dig anyway. They dig past every warning their own oral history could have given them, because the desire for the thing outweighs the memory of how precarious their whole existence already was. The film gives you exactly one shot of a helmet and calls it backstory. That's it. That's the entire theological weight of Khazad-dûm's fall reduced to a prop on a shelf. So the dwarves dig, and they wake something that was never theirs to find. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting if you know what a Balrog actually is, instead of just what a Balrog looks like on screen. This is not a monster in the Grendel sense, some big scary animal with fangs. A Balrog is a Maya, a lesser Ainu, one of the spirits who sang in the music before the world existed, who chose, at some point in that unimaginably deep past, to follow Melkor's discord instead of the harmony everyone else was holding. That's the actual pedigree. Durin's Bane is not a random threat that happened to live in a cave. It is a being of the same fundamental order as Gandalf himself, the same order as Sauron, the same order as the Valar. Just corrupted, just bent toward Melkor's frequency instead of Eru's. And here's the detail that should really bother you. The Silmarillion tells us, in the account of the fall of Beleriand, that when the War of Wrath finally broke Morgoth's armies and the Valar hurled Angband into ruin, the Balrogs that survived didn't surrender, didn't get destroyed in some tidy final battle. They fled. They went to ground, literally, into caves and deep places, and they waited. Tolkien himself, in Letter 144, more or less admits he isn't sure how many of them made it out. The text is deliberately, almost uncomfortably vague on the number, which means the ending of the First Age, The ending everyone treats as the moral resolution of Melkor's war was never actually a resolution. It was a stalemate with really good PR. Durin's Bane sitting under the mountain for a literal age of the world, patient, undetected, is proof that the good triumphs ending of the Silmarillion has an asterisk the size of a mountain range. And while we're picking at loose threads, you know the wings debate never actually settles, right? Go dig into the Treason of Isengard, one of the History of Middle-earth volumes, and you'll find Christopher Tolkien wrestling with his father's own manuscripts over that single line describing a shadow like two vast wings. Earlier drafts are messier, more ambiguous, some readings suggesting the wings a metaphor for the darkness the creature trails behind it, others reading it as physical anatomy. Tolkien never definitively resolved it across revisions, which means the fandom's decades-long argument over "do Balrogs fly" isn't fans being pedantic, it's fans accurately reflecting a genuine unresolved seam in the author's own drafts. I find that more interesting than a firm answer would be, honestly. It's a corrupted Ainu wearing whatever shape terror needs it to wear in that specific moment, and the text's own instability mirrors that. Before we even get to the fight, though, I want to sit for a second on something the films skip past almost entirely, which is Gandalf's own dread about this route. This isn't a wizard striding confidently into a mine. Aragorn warns against it explicitly. He has bad history and worse instinct about Moria, and says so. And Gandalf, when he finally commits to the path, says something close to "do not be afraid, I was once," which is a wizard admitting, out loud, to the people he's leading, that his own confidence here is manufactured rather than genuine. That's a character detail worth more than the entire cave troll sequence Jackson invented for the film. This is a Maya who has walked this world for roughly 2,000 years under deliberate self-imposed restraint, choosing a path he has visible foreboding about, because every other option is worse. That's not recklessness. That's a very old, very tired spirit doing the math on lesser evils and landing on the one that still terrifies him personally. It's not the only thing hiding down there with no explained lineage, which is the part I actually find creepier than the Balrog, if I'm honest. The Watcher in the water gets maybe 90 seconds of screen time in the film. Some tentacles, a door slamming, Boromir looking rattled, and then it's never mentioned again by anyone, ever, in the entire trilogy. And here's the thing, that's actually faithful to the source, because Tolkien never explains it either. Not in the main text, not in Unfinished Tales, not in a stray letter, nowhere. Compare that to basically every other threat in the book. Shelob has a lineage. She's Ungoliant's last daughter. We get that explicitly in the text. Orcs have a contested, but at least attempted origin across multiple versions in Morgoth's Ring. Even the Nazgul have names, kingdoms, a fall we can trace. The Watcher has nothing. It's just there, older than the dwarves' occupation of Moria, indifferent to centuries of mining and orc infestation and dwarvish civilization rising and falling above it, until the one moment the ring passes near the water, and suddenly it's fixated, singularly, on grabbing Frodo specifically and nobody else. That specificity is the tell. This isn't a hungry animal. Something in that water recognizes the ring or reacts to it in a way Tolkien never bothers to explain because, and I think this is the actual point, not every evil in this world is required to have a moral genealogy back to Melkor. Gandalf says it himself later, in The Two Towers, in the chapter where he comes back as the White Rider. He mentions things older and fouler than orcs that gnaw the world's roots, things Sauron himself doesn't know about. The Watcher is one data point in a much larger, much colder idea, that Arda has horrors in it that exist entirely outside the tidy binary of Eru's children versus Melkor's corruption. It's the same category, structurally, as a certain riverside landlord we've talked about on this channel before, a being who exists prior to and independent of the whole Sauron versus everyone framework. Tom is benevolent about it. Whatever's in that lake is not. Same category of older than the plot, wildly different disposition. And then, before the bridge, before anyone even reaches the Balrog, There's Balin's colony, and I think people rush past this too fast because they're impatient to get to the sword fight. The Fellowship finds the Chamber of Misabel, they find the tomb, and Gimli reads aloud from that half-burned record book. And what it describes is not a dramatic last stand, it's attrition, drums in the deep, doors that won't hold, a garrison being worn down room by room until the final entry just stops mid-sentence. That's the second dwarvish attempt to reclaim this place, and it fails the exact same way the first one did, for the exact same underlying reason. The thing they woke is still down there, patient, and no amount of dwarvish courage changes the fact that this was never really their mountain to reclaim once Durin's Bane moved in. Balin's expedition isn't a subplot. It's the mithril greed theme playing out a second time, one age later, with a different generation of dwarves making the same bet against the same house odds. And while we're on the subject of things the film simplifies for the sake of a clean cause and effect chain, the drums. Everyone remembers Pippin as the idiot who wakes the goblins by knocking a bucket down a well. Cause and effect, comedy beat, consequence, very tidy. Go back to the actual text and it's murkier than that, and I think deliberately so. Pippin does drop a stone down an old well shaft out of nervous curiosity, and the sound echoes for a long, unsettling time. But the drums that answer, deep in the mountain, don't start immediately, and Tolkien never actually confirms the two events are causally linked, rather than simply proximate. It's entirely possible the Fellowship's presence would have been detected regardless, that this garrison of orcs was already stirring, already aware. The film needs Pippin's blunder to carry narrative guilt, needs a clean lesson about consequences for the youngest member of the party. The book is comfortable leaving the causality ambiguous, because ambiguity is scarier. It means there was never a safe way through, that the mountain was always going to notice them, with or without a well-meaning fool doing something foolish. Now, the bridge. Let's actually talk about what happens at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, because the film gives you maybe 40 seconds of "you shall not pass," a staff tap, a collapsing bridge, and Gandalf falling with a scream that's frankly one of the more effective needle drops in the trilogy. I'll give it that much credit. But the book, and more specifically what happens after the book's version of that scene, in Gandalf's own account to the Fellowship in Two Towers, describes something on a completely different scale. This isn't a duel that ends at the bridge. It's the opening move of a fight that drags both of them down into the deepest, oldest tunnels beneath Moria, tunnels the world knows not, and then back up through fire and freezing water, all the way to the top of Zirak-Zigil, where they finally finish it on a literal mountain peak, Gandalf hurling his enemy down and the mountainside itself burning from the violence of it. That's not a sword fight, that's a geological event, and it happens mostly off-page, mostly after the Fellowship has already mourned him and moved on. There's a line at the bridge worth pulling apart on its own too. Gandalf naming himself a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor, against the Balrog's flame of Udun. That's not flavor text, that's cosmology. Go back to the Ainul Indale, and the secret fire is explicitly the flame imperishable, the thing Eru alone sends out to give the vision of the music actual, independent existence. It's the difference between a song and a world. Gandalf isn't claiming personal power at that bridge. He's claiming a direct relationship to the one force in the entire cosmology that Melkor searched for across the whole First Age and never once found, because Eru kept it with himself. Udun, meanwhile, is just Angban's other name. The flame of Udun is borrowed light, stolen light, Melkor's counterfeit version of the same principle. So that confrontation on the bridge is, in miniature, the entire theological argument of the legendarium, authentic creative fire that comes from Eru versus a corrupted imitation that can destroy but never truly make. The films keep the line, I don't think they keep the weight. And there's a detail about where that chase actually ends up that I think is one of the best buried jokes, not a funny joke, a cosmic one, in the whole legendarium. Gandalf tells us he and the Balrog fought all the way down into tunnels unknown even to the dwarves, tunnels the Dark Lord dug in ages past, older than Khazad-dûm's own excavations, before the pursuit turns and drives back up, eventually, to the endless stair, a staircase of, by Gandalf's own account, unbroken steps climbing without pause from the deepest roots of the mountain to Durin's tower at its summit. And who built that stair? Dwarves did. It's a feat of engineering so absurd in scale that it's basically the physical monument to the exact same appetite that opened this whole story. The refusal to stop digging, the compulsion to go one level deeper, one step higher, regardless of what it costs. Gandalf's escape route from mortal combat with a Mire is, quite literally, a structure built by the same greed that woke the Mire in the first place. That's not a coincidence Tolkien needed to spell out. It's the mountain rhyming with itself. And here's the hot take, the one I think a lot of casual viewers miss entirely because the films never engage with it. This fight arguably violates the terms of Gandalf's own mission. Go read the Istari essay in Unfinished Tales. The Valar were explicit when they sent the wizards into Middle-earth. No domination, no matching power with power, no compelling anyone, ally or enemy, through overwhelming force or fear. That restriction is the entire reason Saruman's fall is legible as a fall at all. It's the line he crosses, trading persuasion for machinery and dominance. And yet here's Gandalf, unmistakably matching power with power against a being that could level a mountainside, doing exactly the kind of raw, world-shaking magical combat the Istari were sent to avoid. I don't think Tolkien wants us to read this as hypocrisy. I think the necessity is the whole point, that some lines exist precisely so you know the stakes when someone crosses them for the right reason. But it is worth sitting with the fact that the single most iconic action hero moment for the most restrained, most rule-bound wizard in the story is also, technically, the moment he stops playing by his own rulebook. The movies want you to cheer, the text wants you to notice the cost. Because there is a cost, and it's not just physical. Gandalf dies. Not nearly dies, not is badly hurt, dies, fully. And what happens next is one of the most theologically strange passages Tolkien ever wrote, and mostly gets skipped past, because then he came back as Gandalf the White. Sounds like a costume change instead of what it actually is. Gandalf's own description, when he finally recounts it to Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, is that he strayed out of thought and time itself, naked, stripped of everything, drifting for a duration he can't even properly measure, because measurement requires a framework he was temporarily outside of. And crucially, this is the detail I want you to actually sit with. When he says he was sent back, the being doing the sending is never identified as one of the Valar. Tolkien confirms this outside the text too. In letter 156, written to a Jesuit priest, Robert Murray, he's explicit that this is not Manwë's doing, not a Valinorian rescue mission dispatched through the ordinary channels of Valinor's governance. The implication, which Tolkien lets sit rather than spelling out in the narrative itself, is that this is Eru Ilúvatar acting directly, personally, unmediated, reaching into the Third Age for possibly the most clearly attested instance of that in the entire legendarium. It's also worth being honest about something the resurrection retroactively obscures. Gandalf did not know he was going to survive this. There's no safety net visible to him in the moment, no narrative guarantee a Mire gets to lean on. When he tells the Fellowship at the bridge to fly, when he stands alone against Durin's bane, he is doing so as a being who has already been stripped of most of his original power by his own order's restrictions, facing an enemy whose full capability he cannot know in advance, with no promise from Eru, from the Valar, from anyone, that this ends any way other than permanently. That uncertainty is the entire moral weight of the scene, and it's exactly what the resurrection later threatens to flatten if you read it backward instead of forward. If you already know Gandalf the White is coming, the sacrifice stops costing anything. Tolkien's own structure resists that flattening by making the return so strange, so unexplained in the moment it happens, that first-time readers genuinely don't know if the wizard is dead for good until Two Towers confirms it. The films, dealing with an audience that mostly already knew the ending going in, lose access to that particular kind of dread almost by default, which isn't their fault exactly, but it is a real cost of adapting a story the audience has pre-read. And look at what that uncertainty does to everyone left standing on the wrong side of the bridge. Aragorn doesn't get a grief monologue in the text. What he gets is a hard pivot into command. Immediately, the line about doing without hope because hope isn't available to lean on anymore, only duty is. That's Aragorn's whole arc in miniature, compressed into one moment of forced leadership he didn't ask for and doesn't feel ready to hold. Boromir, notably, is the one who has to be told twice to move, which, if you already know where his arc is heading, reads less like simple grief and more like the first visible crack in a man who needed Gandalf's authority to keep his own worse impulses in check. None of that requires the resurrection to land emotionally. It works precisely because, in that moment, as far as anyone in the story knows, it's permanent. Think about how rare that actually is across the whole history of Arda. Eru is, for almost the entire span of the story, a background presence, the one who set the music going and then largely lets the Valar and the Free Peoples work out the consequences among themselves. The other big example of direct, unmediated intervention is the drowning of Númenor, and that's punitive, catastrophic, an axe falling on an entire civilization for its arrogance. This is the opposite gesture entirely, quiet, restorative, aimed at pulling one specific, exhausted spirit back from beyond the world's boundary and sending him back with expanded authority to finish a job he'd only half finished. Same author, same god, same category of unmediated action, and yet the emotional register could not be more different. That contrast alone tells you something about how deliberately Tolkien is using these rare direct interventions, not randomly, but to bookend mercy against judgment. And it happens in a cave system under a mountain that the movies treat as a 15-minute action detour on the way to Lothlorien. I think both major screen adaptations, in their own ways, flatten something the books are doing very deliberately here. Jackson's trilogy needed the Mines of Moria to function as a self-contained action set piece. Cave troll, goblins, bridge, done, next location. Because that's what a 3-hour film adaptation of an 1,100-page book has room for. I don't even think that's a bad choice for the medium, honestly. It's efficient filmmaking, and the bridge sequence is genuinely well constructed as cinema. But it does mean the resurrection reads, on screen, as a twist reveal for Two Towers, rather than what its structure is in the text, which is closer to a resurrection narrative doing real theological work, with an actual sender and an actual theology behind the sending. And Rings of Power, for its part, went the opposite direction and arguably overcorrected, giving Mithril this quasi-magical property tied explicitly to the light of the two trees, and building Sauron's entire ring-forging strategy in Season 2 around acquiring it. It's a choice, and I understand the writer's room logic of wanting a concrete, visually explicable MacGuffin for a streaming audience that needs stakes spelled out fast. But it trades away the much bleaker, much more Tolkien point, which is that Mithril doesn't need to glow with borrowed Silmaril light for its pursuit to be catastrophic. The books don't need a supernatural upgrade to make Khazad-dûm's fall tragic. Ordinary material greed, no magic required, is more than enough to bring down a kingdom. That's arguably a darker, more human thesis than ancient light metal, and I think the show flinched from it a little, reaching for a more legible plot mechanism instead of trusting the uglier, plainer motive Tolkien actually wrote. What I keep coming back to, thinking about all of this together, is that Moria isn't really a location in the way the films present it. A dangerous hallway between two safer places you rush through to get to the next set piece. It's a vertical cross-section of everything this legendarium is actually about. Greed that mirrors the Silmarils sits at the top, made worse by the fact that the people committing it were only ever in the story through an act of mercy in the first place. Beneath that, an unresolved war between Ainur that everyone assumed was finished at the end of the First Age, complete with a genuinely unresolved argument in the author's own drafts about what the surviving enemy even looks like. Beneath that, something even older that Tolkien refuses to explain because not every horror needs a lineage, and the refusal to explain is doing thematic work all on its own. And at the bottom of all of it, quite literally, a death and a return that constitutes maybe the clearest fingerprint of Eru's direct, personal, compassionate hand anywhere in the entire narrative, set against the one other time he acts this directly, which is nothing but judgment. 4 ages, more or less, compressed into one mountain, one bridge, one very bad decision about Mithril, made by people who are long dead before Frodo ever sets foot there. The movies gave you a monster fight. Tolkien gave you a stratigraphy of his entire cosmology, and he buried it under a mountain on purpose, waiting for someone to actually dig for it. Which, unlike the dwarves, I'd argue is exactly the kind of greed this particular story rewards.